Okay? We're in business again. Right, so here's a summary of this one. You have a major intervention title, so that was an example of another space around the translation that can be used. And you have an introduction that is far too positive, given what we know about that to be taken seriously. And there's particularly in view of the distance between that kind of praise and the funny title which completely undermines the guy. There's no need really for an introduction by the translator that can be left as it is, and there's no need for footnotes. And the back cover then balances this kind of mock positive statements with information that you know that the target reader will take to mean that they should approach this book with caution, like the fact that it's written by an Israeli. Okay, so these were all examples, and to finish, I just want to go through some of the conclusions with you very briefly. Just to stress again that even though I have been talking about political text, the definition of political text is not easy, and I don't pretend to have one for it yet. I keep thinking about it and trying to read about it, but I haven't come up with a reliable or credible definition yet. I made the point that there is a big difference between externally sponsored translations and internally sponsored translations, and that externally sponsored translations tend to support very streamlined narratives of the world and of this idea of a unilinear flow of knowledge from the outside to the inside in order to make that target culture better in some way. Whereas internally generated translations tend to engage with a whole range of diverse issues and are undertaken for a whole range of diverse reasons. And it's always, essentially it's knowing what is going on around you. It's being part of the same way that you read the news, you just need to know because you live in the world, not necessarily in order to better yourself as it were. The idea of balancing professional ethos and political imperatives means that you need to, for those who are aware of it and want to go along with the expectations of the public that they are being given unmediated access and so on, it means that you try to keep the spaces of the author and the translation team separate. But as I tried to show you with the various examples, within those spaces that are reserved for the translator and the publisher and so on, the footnotes, the introductions, the titles and so on, you could see, I hope, that translators and other people who work with them really do engage with the text in a variety of ways, sometimes reinforcing the narrative that's elaborated in the text, sometimes directly undermining it and so on. And rather than being invisible, as most people assume they are, because there's a lot of talk about the invisibility of the translator, as it were, you can see that certainly in the case of political text, translators can be extremely visible, and in particular the example of the translations of Huntington, where you have all those footnotes on every page. You can't really have more visibility than that. The translators are almost more visible than Huntington himself in that book. Okay, so that's it, and I hope that it will make you think of some examples in the context of Brazil. Somebody mentioned when I gave this talk in Belo Horizonte, later on in the seminars they came up with examples of things like the USAID project, which apparently was undertaken sometime in the 60s or 70s when USAID sponsored a whole series of translations of textbooks into Brazilian Portuguese, and that kind of influenced the educational system and so on. So there are examples. You might not immediately think of them, but there are examples of it. Okay.
time for some questions.
Do we have a long lead? Yeah, we do.
Would anybody like to make a question or comment?
Look at the camera, look at the camera.
I would like to ask, because I thought something really interesting, because it said, when translating political texts, the translators, they become some sort of commentators, they comment the book all the time.
Not always.
Not always, yes, but sometimes, for example,
Yeah, nothing.
But I found something interesting. The text itself remains as it was mediated, as if the translator didn't work in the text. The text is Huntington's. On the paratext, you can notice that. Is it? Am I right?
It's not always the case, but in my experience, because I'm interested in political text and political translation, in my experience, the more serious the intervention of the translators or the organization that's producing the translation, for example, through the selection of texts that add up to a particular message, the more careful they're going to be to stick to the original text as closely as possible so that people can't say, you have made a mistake, you are misrepresenting the source text. They achieve what they want to achieve through other means. However, in some cases, for example, in the case of the book about Anwar Sadat, there are some very interesting changes in the text itself, but very subtle. So, for example, at one point, the author, Finkelstein, who thinks Sadat was a visionary, says that when Sadat took over as president in Egypt, he had enormous problems to deal with. He inherited a lot of problems to do with education, with transport, with all kinds of things. In the Arabic, it's only a change of a preposition, you almost don't notice it. But the way it reads in Arabic is that with Sadat came all these problems. It's just a minor, and you can almost think maybe it's just a slip of the pen, but together with other little changes like that, it makes you think, something else is going on here. It's almost, this is a particularly interesting book because it's really like a set of coded messages. It's as if the publishers and the translator are talking to the reader above the text itself or below the text itself. So they're going around it in various ways and are talking directly to the reader. As almost as they're in on some kind of conspiracy without actually saying explicitly what it is they're trying to say.
Yeah, just to fill in on the information you were saying about the 1960s in Brazil. The US poured an enormous amount of money into Brazil, as you're saying, publishing textbooks, economics, engineering, marketing, business studies, many other areas. I think McGraw-Hill was the biggest publishing company which was active in Brazil. And so they were translated, I think the Americans paid for translation, and they subsidized the Brazilian publishing companies as well. So the way people would think when studying business studies, etc., would be the American way of thinking.
The right way, because they know what's right.
An interesting study a student of mine made of a similar technique with enormous number of footnotes, introduction, preface, was Carlos Lacerda's translation of Susan Laban et les moins 5, anti-communist tract. And of course he was attacking the government of João Goulart. This was just before the 1964 military coup. So,
And things like Animal Farm, you know, I understand Animal Farm was translated more than once into Brazilian Portuguese, and one of them was an adaptation by Chico Buarque. Again, these are kind of coded messages to evade censorship.
Yeah.